Hi everyone, today we're talking about the descending tracts. So in descending tracts, what happens is that from your cerebral cortex or higher centers of the brain, the information comes down via the descending tracts and then it goes to the effective organ, right? So this is the descending tracts, which are basically white matter bands. Now, it's very important for you to know that the motor neurons are divided into two types, upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron. Upper motor neurons are basically, they originate at the higher level of CNS, and from there it comes down and then it synapses with the lower motor neuron. And lower motor neuron, it directly has the job of innervating the muscles, right? So skeletal muscle. So this is the lower motor neuron and this is the upper motor neuron. So again, here you can see upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron. Upper motor neurons, they originate in the brain and carry signals to the lower motor neurons in the brainstem or spinal cord, while lower motor neurons start in the spinal cord and directly transmit signals from the spinal cord to the muscles. Both are essential for voluntary movement, but they have different functions and locations within the nervous system. Upper motor neurons, their cell bodies are in cerebral cortex. This is the location, and their function is to transmit voluntary motor commands from brain to the lower motor neurons. Higher level control and modulation is provided by the upper motor neurons. Whereas if you talk about the lower motor neuron, their cell bodies are in the brainstem and ventral horn of the spinal cord. So if you look at the spinal cord, so this is your spinal cord. So the lower motor neurons, their cell bodies are in the ventral horn, which is the ventral horn here, ventral gray horn of the spinal cord. So here is exactly where the cell bodies of the lower motor neurons will be, and they'll innervate an external skeletal muscle, right? So this is the lower motor neuron. Now, when you talk about the function, they receive signals from upper motor neurons and carry them directly to the skeletal muscles, causing them to contract. This is the final common pathway for muscle activation. So this image is very crystal clear. So this is the upper motor neuron, and it originates in the cerebral cortex. It terminates somewhere in the brainstem or the spinal cord. From here, from spinal cord, anterior gray horn, there this lower motor neuron initiates and it terminates at the skeletal muscle. So this diagram should make everything clear. For you to memorize lower motor neuron, it begins in the anterior gray horn and then it provides the skeletal muscle, innervates the skeletal muscle. And your upper motor neuron, it begins from the cortex and it terminates somewhere in the spinal cord, right? So this is the difference. Origin of upper motor neuron, cerebral cortex. This one, brainstem and spinal cord, you already know. Its destination is lower motor neurons in brainstem or spinal cord, skeletal muscles. This has to ultimately reach the lower motor neuron, right? And this has to ultimately reach the skeletal muscle. Now, upper motor neuron, its primary function is to transmit signals to the spinal cord. Lower motor neuron, its primary function is to transmit signals from the spinal cord to the muscles. So here you can see this is the upper motor neuron. It can either terminate in the spinal cord or the brain stem. So it terminates in the brain stem. From here, lower motor neurons are going to go to the skeletal muscle. So lower motor neurons, they ultimately have to go to the skeletal muscle. Again, here upper motor neuron terminates in the spinal cord itself. Where exactly? In the anterior gray horn of the spinal cord. And from interior gray horn of the spinal cord, ultimately lower motor neuron in both the cases has to terminate at the skeletal muscle. Right? So this is clear. Upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron should be crystal clear. You shouldn't get confused in that. Now, when you talk about the descending tracts, you can divide them on this very basis, right? So upper motor neurons. Um, they can be of cortical origin or they can be of subcortical origin. Cortical, that they are originating exactly at the cerebral cortex. So if you draw your yes, for example, if this is your cortex, so the cortical origin ones are going to originate right at the cerebral cortex, and subcortical, they might originate somewhere other than the cortex, right? So cortical origin upper motor neurons or tracts, they are corticospinal tract or corticonuclear fibers. So corticospinal tracts, they're also known as pyramidal tracts, and corticonuclear fibers, which are uh, corticonuclear, so somewhere from the nuclei, from the corticomesencephalic. Mesencephalic is in midbrain, remember? Mesencephalic, so this was like central gray matter, then cerebral aqueduct, then here you had mesencephalic nuclei of the trigeminal nerve. So this was at the midbrain transverse section. So corticomesencephalic, corticopontine. Pontine are also nuclei, right, in the pons level, right? Then corticomedullary or corticobulbar. So this is at the medulla oblongata level. So corticobulbar or medullary. So midbrain, pons, and medulla. So corticomesencephalic, corticopontine, corticomedullary, or corticobulbar. These are also of cortical origin, but they aren't beginning right from the cortex. I mean, they are beginning from cortex, but from the nuclei in the cortex. So corticospinal tract and sorry, not sorry, I made a mistake. They're beginning from cortex as well, but they are terminating at the nuclei, the different nuclei, and this is terminating at the spine, like the spinal cord, right? So the upper motor neuron, it has to terminate somewhere in the brain stem. So this is the brain stem, or somewhere in the spinal cord. So this was the uh, entire summary of this, right? It has to either terminate at the brainstem or the spinal cord. So the one terminating at the spinal cord, that's corticospinal tract, and the one that is terminating at the uh, brainstem, that's corticonuclear. So brainstem, mesencephalic, pontine, and medullary corticobulbar. So midbrain, pons, and medulla. This is the brainstem, right? So they're terminating. They're beginning in the cortex only. So cortical origin. So upper motor neuron of cortical origin are there. So they're beginning or originating from the cortex, but their terminating point is different, brainstem or spinal cord, right? Now, here there should be a little bit of you need to tweak this because you need to tweak this up because cerebral cortex isn't the primary origin for it is the primary origin for upper motor neuron, but there can be other origin as well, subcortical origin, right? So there is subcortical origin as well for this. So upper motor neurons, they can either have a cortical origin or a subcortical origin. So if you talk about its subcortical origin, so they can be tectospinal coming from tectum. They can be rubrospinal coming from the like rubrospinal, right? So this is coming from the red nucleus. Rubrospinal comes from the red nucleus. Reticulospinal coming from the reticular formation. Vestibulospinal coming from the vestibular nuclei. Olivospinal coming from the inferior olivary nucleus, right? So these are your subcortical tracts. So again, motor neurons divided in upper motor neuron, lower motor neuron. Upper motor neuron, I told you they can begin from cerebral cortex and they can terminate either in the brain stem or they can terminate either in the spinal cord. So spinal cord, corticospinal, also known as the pyramidal tract, and if they terminate in the nuclei of the brain stem, so these are the three: mesencephalic, pontine, and medullary or bulbar. And they can be of subcortical origin, tectospinal, then rubrospinal, reticulospinal, vestibulospinal, and olivospinal. So these are your descending tracts in total. So these are five, this is three, and this is one. So nine in total, right? So I hope you can remember. And do not forget corticospinal. This is the major one, and this is also known as the pyramidal tract, right? Now here, I've written one more distinguishing point as well: pyramidal tracts and extrapyramidal tracts. So this is like a primitive concept. Uh, Previously, any origin from cerebral cortex, those were known as pyramidal tracts, and those which weren't originating from cortex, they were known as extrapyramidal tracts. So, for example, if this begins in brainstem, so these are extrapyramidal. This begins in cortex, so this is pyramidal tract, right? And obviously, the ones beginning in cortex, they have fine motor skills, precise movements, and they control voluntary and conscious control. Extrapyramidal tracts are for involuntary automatic control and for posture, balance, and muscle tone. This is the things that they maintain, right? So yeah. Now, when you talk about okay, this is your corticospinal tract. So let's like review the corticospinal tract. So I'll be reading everything off the Snell's book and I hope it will be useful. So corticospinal tracts, these tracts are there for voluntary, discrete, skilled movement. These are there for the voluntary. Let's jot all of this down. Shall we? I think it's important to jot it down right here. So first of all, your corticospinal tract, also known as pyramidal tracts, these are important for discrete, voluntary, discrete, and skilled movement. Discrete and skilled movement. So this is corticospinal tract, voluntary, discrete, and skilled movement. So do not forget, it is for voluntary, discrete and skilled movement. For example, if you're moving your fingers, so that needs a very skilled movement, and it should be like very minute and detailed movement. Reticulospinal. When you talk about reticulospinal, the ones that are originating from your reticular formation. Remember, reticular formation was a switch that could on and off your attention. So it was basically to uh, reticular formation was for making sure that cerebral cortex is on or off, right? It could do either of those. So it's basically a switch. So therefore, this can either or inhibit, facilitate or inhibit voluntary movement, right? And obviously, cerebral cortex that's for voluntary movement. Then if you move to your tectospinal tract, this tectospinal, so we already know spinotectal, right? Spinotectal, that you feel something on your foot and then quickly you, like retract your foot from that place of obstacle, right? So that's called spinotectal. But tectospinal is when you see something and then suddenly your body changes. So basically, it reflects postural movement because of any visual changes. Reflects postural changes because of the visual stimulus. Okay, now next is your aerospinal tract. This facilitates the activity of flexor muscles. So this is going to facilitate the flexor muscles and inhibit the extensor muscles activity. Rubrospinal. It's going to facilitate flexor and inhibit the activity of the extensor anti-gravity muscles. Vestibulospinal is quite the opposite. It's going to facilitate the activity of the extensor and it's going to inhibit the activity of the flexor muscles. So it is quite the opposite. So extensor is the anti-gravity muscle. And olivospinal, it can play a role in muscular activity, but some of the anatomists, they doubt its existence, but it is there to play a role in the muscular activity, you can say. Yes, so this is like, in short, I've told you all their functions. So very quickly, voluntary discrete skilled movement. This is for the reflex postural changes in regards to the visual stimulus, rubrospinal. So this stimulates flexor muscles contraction. Vestibulospinal, it stimulates extensor muscles contraction. And vestibular, this helps you to stand, right? And rubrospinal helps you to sit down. Flexor helps you to sit down. Reticulospinal, it facilitates or inhibits voluntary movement, so it can do either. Olivo is for muscular activity. Now, yeah. Now, when you talk about corticospinal tracts, the fibers of the corticospinal tract, they're going to arise as axons of the pyramidal cell. So that's the reason it's known as pyramidal tract, because its fibers are going to arise as axons of pyramidal cell from, okay, wait, I think I need to increase the thickness of the pen because I cannot write neatly. So they are axons of the pyramidal cells, and from which layer of cerebral cortex? From the fifth layer of the cerebral cortex. Fifth layer of the cerebral cortex. Yes. So these are the pyramidal cells, which is situated in the fifth layer of the cerebral cortex. From here, the axons arise, and afterwards,